everyone. Welcome to today's summit, Best Practices for Managing and Securing Microsoft 365. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, CoreView, Backupify, AvaPoint, KOSoft, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends in the Converge 360 group of 1105 Media, and I will be your moderator for the first of three information-packed sessions. But before we get started today, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. As you leave the summit today, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our team reads every comment, and they help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a set of high-end Bose wireless noise-canceling Bluetooth headphones. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. And now let's get started with our first session, Microsoft 365 Management Best Practices for the Enterprise. For this session, we called on our old friend Ben Stejink, owner and chief cloud consultant at IntelliGink. Ben is an information technology pro with extensive experience with Microsoft platforms, including Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and Azure. During his busy career, he has consulted with a wide range of organizations, from five-person shops to global enterprises in fields ranging from government to professional sports. He is a Microsoft certified trainer and co-host of the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast, where he discusses the latest technologies in the Microsoft 365 and Azure universe from an IT point of view. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Ben.
All right, John. Thanks for having me back. Glad to be back for another one of these sessions. I'm looking forward to today's session about some of the best practices for some of the management security around your Microsoft 365 environment. So we're going to kind of go through some high-level concepts, and then I'm going to dive into some of my favorite features when it comes to managing Office 365. So hopefully you'll get some good tips and tricks out of these, things to go back and think about. A few of these slides do have links on them, and you can always go grab those resources. John mentioned them. Grab the slides so you can get the links from there. So you don't need to worry about trying to quick type them in or remember these links. So kicking things off, the first best practice that I have when it comes to Microsoft 365 is simply knowing your admin centers. Microsoft 365, as it's changed, grown, evolved over the past really 8-10 years now or so, the admin centers have changed. And I've kind of broken up some of the big ones here that you really need to know about, understand. And the first one is just the Microsoft Admin Center. This is going to be that landing spot for all things Microsoft 365. Going to admin.microsoft.com, understanding what's in there from the organizational settings, knowing what other admin centers you can get to. And we're not going to go through and talk through all of these different admin centers, but I really want to hone in on that. There's lots of them out there. There's that Microsoft Admin Center, Azure AD. This is one a lot of people forget about when they come to admin centers. They simply go into their users within the Microsoft Admin Center, the groups within there. But if you have Microsoft 365, go over to Azure AD, to aad.portal.azure.com. You can actually just go to portal.azure.com and go into Azure Active Directory there. It's part of the Office 365 management. There's a lot of different things you can do within the Azure AD Admin Center when it comes to security and conditional access, insider risk management and compliance, risky sign-ins, risky logins, risky users. There's a lot of different functionality in that Azure AD Admin Center. And then you do have your typical SharePoint, Exchange, Teams for managing those different products. And then you also have those shared admin centers. I classify these as shared because the functionality in these particular admin centers really spans all of those products. It spans Azure Active Directory. It spans SharePoint, Exchange, and Teams. The Security Admin Center, in terms of being able to go in and manage security across all of your different products. Get your secure score. How secure is my Office 365 environment? What are some things that I can do to Microsoft 365 to better protect myself, to better secure myself, to manage incidents? If you do have security incidents, you can go in and look at different incidents that may arise within that security center. The Compliance Center, this one, if anybody missed the news yesterday, could get renamed to Purview, maybe. Yesterday, Microsoft announced Purview is the new compliance product for all things Microsoft. It used to be Azure Purview. It got renamed to Microsoft Purview, and all of the Compliance Center products got new names related to Purview. So if you want to go check that out, there's some articles. Go look at Twitter, go search for articles. You'll find all things about that. But the Compliance Center is where you can go in and handle your data loss prevention. You have a compliance score, just like you have a secure score, where you can go see how are you doing from a compliance standpoint in terms of data privacy or sensitive information within your organization. A lot of people think of Microsoft 365 and they think of SharePoint, Exchange, and Teams. They go out and buy a third-party product to help with data loss prevention, to help with watching for sensitive information going out via email. They don't realize you can actually set up labels within your Compliance Center to label sensitive information within there, or to retention labels. Set up retention policies around when you want to expire certain content, delete certain content, have content go through a lifecycle management. There are a lot of pieces of functionality within that Compliance Center that you can take advantage of as a part of your Microsoft 365 subscription to make sure that you are staying in compliance. Endpoint management is another great one for managing devices, whether this is mobile device management, mobile application management, managing Windows 10, managing antivirus on Windows 10, making sure all of your devices stay compliant, kind of tying back to some of the compliance stuff. Endpoint management has consolidated a whole bunch of those features around managing mobile devices as well as desktop devices for your organization. And then Defender for Cloud Apps. If you even want to take Microsoft 365 and start managing content and protecting content when it comes to other clouds, Dropbox, AWS, Box, some of those other third-party services that users may be using, and you need to manage. You need to make sure they're not taking sensitive information out of Office 365 or from their desktops and uploading it to some of these other services. You can go take advantage of Defender for Cloud Apps to go do that. I really recommend every administrator, and if you're watching Microsoft 365, if you're in that space, go just click around through these admin centers. I do this regularly. I go log into my admin center and I start clicking through different functionality, different features, different menus. There are always new things popping up in these admin centers, new things popping up within certain features or different services when it comes to things like maybe conditional access, There was some new products that showed up in Compliance Center the other day. Hadn't seen them, hadn't heard any announcements about them, just showed up as a menu option in my Compliance Center. So as administrator, as you're managing your environment, really go dive through all these different admin centers. Look at the functionality that's there. Understand what you have as an organization to better secure your environment. I also posted a little link on here. There's a third-party browser extension that I have in mind. It's on the right there. This is actually a screenshot of that extension. If you need to help keep track of those admin centers, just go grab this extension. It's free. Throw it in your browser, and it actually gives you links not just to all the different admin centers, but to different portions within the admin center, whether it's users, teams management, managing those teams, just a handy little tidbit. I find this invaluable. I cannot always keep track of all the admin center links, but I really encourage you, go understand what are all those capabilities that you have within your admin centers and go explore those. Next up, from a management perspective, is know where you should be looking for different announcements. This could be product releases, product updates, certain services or certain aspects of services being deprecated within Microsoft 365. This is my slide that has all the links. Again, go download the PDF files, download these slides, use these links. But these are kind of my go-to locations when I want to know what's going on within those Microsoft 365 environments that I manage. First is the Message Center. This is in the Admin Center. This is going to have updates around feature rollouts, feature deployments. This does have things that can be specific to your environment. I think of things like basic authentication, SMTP relays. There were some changes coming around that to Exchange Online, when that's going to get turned off in certain tenants, different reporting that Microsoft is doing based on if you use it or not, that may get disabled in your environment. Things like that are going to show up in the Message Center where Microsoft can contact you directly about certain features or certain telemetry that they are capturing on your usage and how your usage is going to be affected by certain features or certain changes that they're putting out there. You're also going to see a lot of general announcements in here that apply to maybe licenses you have, different changes that they're making. So go look through the Message Center really on a daily basis. General rule of thumb, I probably see anywhere from 10 to 15 new messages in my Message Center every single day. Sometimes it may be a little more, sometimes it may be a little less. Sometimes a bunch of them may just be updates about deployment schedules if you're looking for when a certain feature is going to hit. But just go flip through this on a daily basis. The Microsoft 365 roadmap is another really good resource. This is where Microsoft tries to give you a good feeling of features that are in preview, features that hit general availability, what that timeline is going to be. Is it going to be March of 2022? Is it going to be June of 2022? You'll see things that even go like to Q1 of 2023. But if you're wanting to try to keep an eye on what's coming, that Microsoft 365 roadmap is a key resource. I also posted underneath there an RSS feed. That feed burner link to the Office 365 Roadmap Watcher. This is not a site, but an RSS feed that I subscribe to, I watch all the time. That goes and looks at the Microsoft 365 roadmap and actually pulls out what items on the roadmap were updated or added on any certain day. So if you don't want to go try to dig through the roadmap, go subscribe to this RSS feed. Just check that. These 3 features were added to the roadmap, or these 5 features were updated on the roadmap. Great resource. And super important as you're managing Office 365 to stay abreast of what those changes are. Tech community blogs, longer form articles, Message Center and Roadmap are pretty quick, short blips. Tech community blogs, going to give you all kinds of information about new products. I don't need to dive into that one too much. Go subscribe to that blog. And then service status. This is another key one that I watch. Status.office.com. If somebody contacts me as I'm managing Office 365 and saying, we have a problem, something's not working, I go check status.office.com first, or I go check that Twitter account, MSFT365 status. Is there something going on in Microsoft 365 that's causing these issues to occur? Some type of incident, some type of advisory about certain functionality not working. There was one yesterday about accessing files in SharePoint and OneDrive. There was an issue going on. Microsoft 365 status was tweeting about it pretty regularly, about the status. They're resolving it. They're digging into it, which users could be affected by it. This is, I think, the only Twitter account that I follow that I have alerts set for, is this Microsoft 365 status. Because the only thing they're going to tweet about is potential issues that you might see with Microsoft 365, with any of the services. So from a management perspective, know where all these announcements are coming from, where they're all located, how you can keep up to date on what's going on. The next one, where can sprawl originate? I come from a long background in SharePoint, back from the SharePoint 2003 days. I have seen sprawl within Microsoft products. One of the best examples I probably have, I went into a client and they wanted to do a SharePoint migration. Said, okay, great, we can migrate SharePoint. We can migrate sites, we can migrate pages. How many do you have? Oh, we probably have about 400 or 500 SharePoint sites. Ran some scripts, did some reporting. They had 6,000 SharePoint sites. They were off in magnitudes of thousands of sites. Microsoft 365 can have the same problem. SharePoint, you can still have sprawl. By default, users can go in and create sites. They can create Microsoft 365 groups. They can create teams. All three of these enabled for all of your users right out of the box. If you have done nothing to eliminate those, users could be going in creating sites natively within SharePoint. They could be creating Microsoft 365 groups. Those groups are actually, in turn, creating SharePoint sites. They could be creating teams, or they could be creating channels within teams that are leading to additional SharePoint sites. Private channels, the recently previewed shared channels and teams, both create their own SharePoint sites, not to mention the root team that gets its own SharePoint site. If you're not keeping a handle on this, I would say you don't have to shut it down. Different companies have different policies around which users can create sites. Do I let all users create them? Do I send them through a request process so I at least see what they're creating, but I'm not going to make them go through an approval? Some companies may want to go through an approval process. You can only create these items when it's been approved. There's ways to do all of that, whether you go buy some third-party products to help with this. I have built my own using Power Automate, Power Apps, SharePoint lists, PowerShell, different things within the Microsoft Cloud. But really knowing where sprawl can originate, and from a management perspective, knowing how do you want to handle this, or how do you want to address this? Is it simply reporting so that you know if it's starting to get out of hand? Or do you set some type of gate in place to prevent users from creating these things? Power Apps and Power Automate are another one that I have seen sprawl here, in that any user can go in and create a Power App if they have that license, or they can go in and create Power Automate to create their own tasks. Again, great tools, lots of power here. I'm not saying go shut this down, but know what's going on. There's a Center of Excellence starter kit that is out there that you can go find, download, install it. It can take a little bit. It's not a click, 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 and it's out there in 30 minutes. It may take you a couple hours, 3 hours to get set up to refine it. But that can help with even just reporting on what do you have out there within that Power Platform, within Power Apps and Power Automate, and helping you to manage the life cycle of that. So as you continue to move forward with Microsoft 365, as maybe it becomes more prevalent or more popular, or your organization is simply growing, know where sprawl can originate and how you want to handle that, whether it's from a creation process or simply a management and reporting process when it comes to some of that sprawl. And then finally, this is one of those that I also see as, let's say, understand the connections. How do different products within Microsoft 365 relate to other products? If you follow the space, you may see debates. People are out there, their Teams files and their SharePoint files, and I wouldn't say it's caused fist fights, but I have seen some very opinionated debates. Some people that have very strong feelings one way or the other. And is it Teams files or SharePoint files? End of the day, they're files, they're surfaced in Teams, but they are stored in SharePoint. That's where all those files are going to be hosted. So understand that connection between Teams files, between when a team is created and when a channel is created, and how that's going to affect SharePoint. Understand that when somebody makes changes to a document library in SharePoint, especially if that SharePoint site is connected to a team, how that could affect Teams or even the visibility of files within Teams. So understand that connection between your Teams files, those files in Teams, and the SharePoint site and the files that ultimately end up stored on the back end in SharePoint. Same thing with Microsoft Lists. Microsoft Lists are stored as SharePoint lists on the back end. If you create a list in SharePoint, it ends up getting surfaced within Microsoft Lists. If you've ever clicked to create a new Microsoft list or a new SharePoint list, you'll actually see the exact same UI in terms of being able to choose templates, what it looks like when you're going in and creating these lists. So the connection there. Your connection between Azure Active Directory and securing your Office 365 and your Microsoft 365 environment. I don't see this one as much anymore. I used to go into clients, go in and talk to people and talk about Office 365, Microsoft 365. Azure Active Directory would come up and they would be like, oh, we don't have Azure. We don't have Azure Active Directory. Well, yes, you do. Azure Active Directory is where all your security groups are stored, your Microsoft 365 groups, your users, your password resets. That's all Azure Active Directory on the back end. If you have Office 365, Microsoft 365, you have Azure Active Directory, and there's features in there that you can use and take advantage of. SharePoint and the Power Platform. If you're going in and customizing list forms in SharePoint, and if you're going and creating flows from Power Automate, how the two of those work together, how you can use PowerPoint or Power Platform, Power Apps and Power Automate to really enhance your SharePoint environment, how people may be going in and creating Power Apps and using Power Automate by adding those workflows to a SharePoint list or by customizing that form on a SharePoint list. So that's another one of those connections that are there. Stream, you're going to start seeing Stream V2. I just started seeing some stuff about initial previews and testing of migrating the original Stream platform into Stream V2, in the fact that Stream V2 is SharePoint. They're taking those video files that were in Stream, those meeting recordings from Teams, and those are now starting to get recorded in SharePoint. Eventually, that'll be the default, and the only option is all of those meeting recordings and videos are going to go into SharePoint. And again, private channels, shared channels, they get a new SharePoint site. So I really encourage everybody that I talk to. This actually came up recently with a client the other day that I was talking to about their organization and how they have people that are focused on SharePoint, they have people that are focused on Exchange. That's great, but more and more, it is really important that these teams that are focused on maybe these different products, especially in big enterprises, talk to each other. They communicate with each other. Maybe you have to have somebody where you have an individual that looks at those updates across the Microsoft 365 platform as a whole. We talked about those roadmaps in those different locations. But understanding that entire ecosystem of Microsoft 365 and how a change that somebody makes in Exchange, or a change that the security team makes in Azure AD, a change that just the SharePoint team makes in SharePoint, could have rippling effects down to these various products. How meeting recording meetings that are now getting stored in SharePoint can affect the amount of storage you have in SharePoint, because now you have all these recordings going into SharePoint. Understanding that there's expiration on those. They're going to get deleted 90 days after they're recorded, unless you go in and make changes. But the Teams team, the SharePoint team, may not necessarily be communicating about that or understanding it. So no matter which product you're working with in Microsoft 365, even if you are focused at your company on one of these products, take time to understand the whole ecosystem. You don't necessarily have to be an expert in the whole ecosystem, but you should definitely learn about the different components of it, how they're connected together, so that when it comes to managing it and making changes and making updates, you at least have an awareness of who else it may impact or who else you need to talk to about what you're doing. Next up, know what you have. I touched on this a little bit when I started talking about the shared admin centers. What are those tools that you have that are a part of Microsoft 365? Are you leveraging MFA? Did you know about MFA? Did you know about conditional access and how you can use conditional access with MFA in Office 365? Data loss prevention, or I didn't put it on here, the spam filtering in Exchange Online. I have sat in a room with people and brought up data loss prevention or sensitivity labels, the Exchange Online mail protection and some of the functionality that's involved there, and had people that have no idea that that's even a part of Microsoft 365. They've been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for a third-party product. Maybe that third-party product has a place. I have also been with clients where they're like, yep, we're using this for mail protection. We're using this other product for MFA. We'll talk through it. And they have very valid reasons for using third-party products. But other people simply have no awareness of these tools that are a part of Microsoft 365 that they could be using and they could be taking advantage of to help manage their environment. The sensitivity labels, retention policies, I'm going to talk about sensitivity labels here in a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that, but there's a lot of powerful things you can do with sensitivity labels and retention labels. Logging and alerting, this is another one that if you haven't used this, you can go in and turn this on. I get emails and alerts from Office 365 when certain activities occur. Files have been shared externally, and they have been shared for more than, I think, 90 days is how I have my alert set up. I get an alert that there are some stale externally shared files out there. Do I want to go in and address those? Go in and remove that sharing link from it. I got one the other day that I actually had it set to 31 days before the sharing expires. It was an email. This person's going to lose access to this file. If you need them to have access to it, go in and make changes to it. I've gotten alerts. You can set up emails about suspicious activity, apps that are maybe logging in that appear to maybe have some suspicious activity, whether it's due to certain resources they're accessing, different locations or IP addresses that these apps are logging into. Things like impossible travel, a user logging in from two different places at the same time. You can get those emails from that alerts and all that logging around that data. Unified audit log is another big one when it comes to logging and alerting. If you haven't gone in and looked at the audit log in the, I believe it's in the Compliance Center. It used, when it was the Combined Security and Compliance Center, it was in there. I think it's now in the Audit Search and Compliance Center. I believe it's up over 100 different activities that are tracked across your Office 365 environment. You can go in and look at what's going on. And I use this not just from a security and compliance perspective, but something as simple as a user has come to me and said, I lost a file. I lost an email. It used to be in this particular site. It used to be in this particular team. It's not there anymore. What happened to it? You can go use that unified audit log, search for that file, find out the activities. More often than not, I found out that somebody else accidentally deleted it or even moved it. They took that file, moved it to a different SharePoint site. I'm able to resolve that crisis of a missing file by using that audit or that logging that's built in, that unified audit log that's built into Microsoft 365. And then endpoint management, whether this is autopilot for deploying new machines, getting users onboarded, whether it's your antivirus, monitoring compliance, pushing out updates to Windows, updates to Office, making sure hard drives are encrypted, setting certain pins. Endpoint management has gotten really, really good, in my opinion, in Microsoft 365. There's other tools out there. Other tools have their strengths, but there's a lot you can do now with endpoint management. You can even do website blocking. I have one client I'm working with right now. They want to block certain categories of sites. Endpoint management has web filtering capabilities, web logging capabilities built into it, so you can even track some of those user activities in terms of, we have a user spending 4 hours a day on YouTube or on Facebook or visiting inappropriate sites on their work computers. So logging it or just outright blocking it. Lots of stuff there from endpoint management. So know what all of these different tools are. It goes back to exploring those admin centers, diving into all of that functionality and those capabilities that you have. Microsoft 365 has quickly grown to much more than just hosted SharePoint, Exchange, Teams, or it used to be Skype, but really that whole suite of tools with lots of other capabilities and tools you can take advantage of when it comes to managing Office 365. So kind of a high level of what are some things you should think about when it comes to some of those management best practices. Now I want to dive into some of my favorites. I mentioned a couple of them in here, but looking at what are these capabilities, what are some of these tools that you can really leverage when it comes to Microsoft 365. And I'm going to start with sensitivity labels. I think this is one of the, what I have seen is it's an underused capability, particularly when it comes to groups, which I put teams in parentheses. When you create a team, you create a Microsoft 365 group. So if you make some of these changes to Microsoft 365 groups, it trickles down and also affects teams. Again, one of those links that you should be aware of. Files and emails, sensitivity labels have been there for a while. I'm not going to talk to those as much as I am groups, teams, and SharePoint sites right now. If you go in and enable this for groups and teams and your SharePoint sites, you can go start classifying, when I create a team, what is the sensitivity on this? And this could be labels that are things like confidential, internal only. In mine, I have some that are clients, partners, internal, administrative. Maybe you have one that could be executive. You go in and you create these labels. And once you create these labels, you can actually set certain rules as to how this team or this group or a SharePoint site will behave when a certain label is applied to it. So one of those first things that you always get when you go create a new team is, what is the privacy of this? Is this a public team or is this a private team? Users may not necessarily be able to correlate in their heads, well, this team is for my executives. Is it public or is it private? Or this team is for a client. how am I supposed to create client teams? Is this supposed to be a public or a private? But they can usually very quickly in their head say, oh, this is client. This is for the board. This is for the executive team. This is internal only. This is going to be confidential. And then you can say anytime somebody selects that particular label, when they create a team, it's automatically public or it's automatically private, or you can leave the choice up to them. So it helps with some of that compliance of, okay, these certain teams have to have these conditions applied to them. Another one is external sharing. This is a confidential team, so I'm not going to allow sharing of it. This is only going to be people in our organization. Users now no longer have to make those choices. You no longer have to go in and make changes or handle requests to maybe change sharing permissions on the files in that team or that SharePoint site. But based on that label they choose, that automatically gets applied in terms of what sharing is allowed, in terms of if it's a public team or a private team, or even starting to use conditional access policies. This SharePoint site, because it's labeled confidential, not only is it for only people in your organization, but it's also only allowed for web access. Or this client site can be shared with anybody, but clients aren't allowed to download stuff from it. It's going to be web only when it comes to those external users. Or you're going to just outright block access. So you actually have conditional access policies now that can be set on a site-by-site level, and you can use labels to automatically set up those conditional access policies on that site-by-site level, just simply based on the label that's selected when a team is created. So this is one of mine. I love this capability because, again, if users are creating teams and you want them to be able to quickly choose, the labels, you can make them so they make sense to them. And then in the back end, go set up from a management perspective, based on a given label, this site or this team or these files have to be configured in a certain way. The next one, conditional access. I alluded to this in sites. I have told clients, from my perspective, this is one of the most compelling reasons I see for Azure Active Directory Premium Plan 1. You get this on that Plan 1 level. It's included everywhere else, Premium Plan 2. So it is an Azure AD Premium feature. But the capabilities you have with conditional access for the $4 or $5 a month per user for Azure AD Premium, I think a lot of times it's worth it. I've had clients that have bought Azure AD Premium simply for this benefit. You get a lot of other functionality with it as well, but this allows you to go in and set certain signals, certain users. What devices is a user using? Are they logging in from a device joined to our domain? Are they logging into a device joined to Azure Active Directory? Are they logging into a device that is configured in a way that it's compliant with our company's standards? What location are they logging into? Are they sitting in our office, or are they sitting some other location? If they're on a mobile device, what geography are they in? Latitude, longitude, general area. Is the IP address they're logging into from a certain country? Or what app are they using? Are they using built-in apps on their devices, or are they using Outlook or one of the Microsoft apps? What are these different signals to know who a user is, where they're logging in from, what they're logging in on, and what app they're using to log in to? Based on all of those different signals, let's choose how much access we're going to get, or are we going to give them access? Are we going to go in and just say, that IP address is from a country that we don't have any users in, that we don't have any offices in, nobody's traveling to? We're just going to shut down any access request from a given country. Or this user, we don't recognize this device. Let's make sure it's actually them and prompt for multi-factor authentication when they're logging in from a device we don't recognize. Or maybe this is a device that's not owned by our company. We don't want them to be able to download documents to their friend's computer or to their partner's computer. So we're going to give them web-only access from this particular computer. So they can go check their email, they can read a document, but that document or that email is not going to leave our Microsoft 365 environment. Or requiring certain apps. We don't really have the ability to control the built-in app on Android or the built-in mail app on iOS. So we're going to require that if they want to go connect an app to our Microsoft 365 environment, they're going to use Outlook, or they're going to use the Office 365 app, or they're going to use the Word app. One of those applications that we can control. So going in and setting up these different signals and decisions and cases, and then being able to enforce how users can interact with their environment and what they're allowed to do is, from a management perspective, really key, in my opinion, to helping control and secure your data in Microsoft 365. And this is across the entire platform. You can even take advantage of this if you're doing single sign-on. Azure AD, other apps that are registered to Azure Active Directory, you can go in and apply conditional access policies too, because this is taking place in Azure Active Directory at that time of the authentication and authorization to those specific apps. So again, conditional access, I could probably talk the entire time just about different things you can do with conditional access. Logging and alerting is another one. I talked about the unified audit log, those activities stored for 90 days. You can go in and look at those. Here's an example of one of those matches that was found for my environment. I got this email, this alert that there were multiple failed logins under my user account from a specific IP address. They all occurred 10 times within a minute. I'm going to go in and review it and take care of that alert. See if it was something that went south on my computer or something that happened somewhere else, that it was actually someone trying to breach my environment. Azure Sentinel, if you want to start consolidating cloud logs, your Azure Active Directory sign-in logs with the unified audit logs, with maybe even logs from other devices. Azure Sentinel has a bunch of functionality of consolidating all those logs into a cloud-native SIEM. There is definitely some licensing and some pricing that comes into play when it comes to Azure Sentinel. But being able to query all of your logs, write those Custo queries, the KQL queries, to look across all your data. I think there's 8 or 9 different connectors in Sentinel to pull different information out of different logs in Microsoft 365, from Azure Active Directory to the Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, to that unified audit log. Azure Sentinel is, again, one of those really powerful tools when it comes to managing those logs, managing incident responses, being able to actually drill through an incident and see all of the different related activities that are related to a particular incident, based on the IP address they originated from, based on the user that was performing those. Another great tool, not Microsoft 365, Azure tool, Azure pricing, but a lot of integration points for managing it. And then Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, I mentioned this one earlier, that cloud access security broker, being able to tie in additional cloud applications to your management in sensitivity labels, conditional access policies. All of those can take advantage of some of those connections you can make with Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps in being able to monitor and secure data, not just in Microsoft 365, but extending out to some of those other cloud products as well. And then the final one, mobile application management. This is one of those that is perfect for bring your own device, those BYOD scenarios. This also, a lot of times I've seen, can replace some of the mobile device management. What mobile application management is, it's a part of your security in your endpoint management. is it hones in on protecting corporate data in an application. Think Outlook on a device. Maybe I have my personal email there, but I also have my corporate email there. This mobile application management is perfect for controlling just that corporate data in Outlook. You quit the company, the device is lost, you want to make sure your corporate data is protected. Wipe out the corporate data on the device, leave all the personal data alone, especially in that case where it's a BYOD scenario. You want to be good to your employee. You don't want to do a factory reset or control their whole personal device, but you are very concerned about your data on that device, and you want to have that ability to protect that data, to wipe that data from their device, to set certain policies in place. My corporate data, it can live on your device, but you can't back it up to your iCloud. So go ahead, let them back up their device to iCloud. Let them back it up to the Google backup. But don't back up your corporate data there. Require a PIN on that device. Maybe they don't care who reads their personal email, but you care that if someone gets into that device and they try to open corporate email, that it's going to require a PIN within that application to access that email. So this is a perfect blend of giving users the ability to use their device for personal tasks. If it's a personal device, to be able to use it like they normally would, but still protect that corporate data. Other examples that you do have there is copying and pasting. You don't want users to copy email from Outlook into a text message and send it. You can block copy and pasting between apps that you manage as a part of mobile application management and unmanaged apps. So two apps are managed, copy and paste between them all you want to because we can manage that corporate data. But as soon as you want to try to move that to an unmanaged app, we're going to block it. I mentioned PINs, blocking that ability to print corporate data. You don't want them to print emails from their mobile device. Keep, though, that corporate data safe. Again, another one of my favorite features when it comes to device management, especially BYOD scenarios. Working with a client right now, very similar situation. They want users to bring in personal devices, or users bring in personal devices. They want to enable them to use those for business use, but need to be able to protect data for compliance reasons, for HIPAA, PII, all of that. This mobile application management can really help control that, wrap that corporate data in the app within a layer of protection while still allowing them to use the device as they would. So those are some of my favorites, some tips and tricks I have for management. It looks like we probably have a few questions here, John, and hopefully some time to dive into a few of these questions for a couple minutes.
We absolutely do. Thank you, Ben. I want to remind everyone that you can still type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Let's start with this one. Looks like it's from Raymond. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Can we have different license types in our Azure environment? For example, I want our consultants to have conditional access, and the rest I want E3 plus compliance for DLP.
I would put like a conditional yes on there. It can vary based on license to license. Conditional access in particular, all the research, everything I've done, conditional access is the biggest gray area I've seen. What it appears to be, and I'm going to put the disclaimer on here, I'm not a licensing expert. Go talk to a licensing expert to be sure, is that you can do conditional access and license it for only those users that you want conditional access in place for. And if you are not going to use conditional access with the rest of your users, you don't necessarily have to buy that premium license for every user in your organization if you can make that clear distinction between these users are using premium licenses, these users are not. There are other cases, like groups is another one. If you want to limit groups and teams creation, Microsoft explicitly says the users that are allowed to create groups and teams and the users that are the ones limiting who can create groups and teams need to have that Azure AD premium license to create them and to limit the creation. But all the other users that are blocked from creating them or aren't involved in the administration point of it don't need to have a license. So it does vary a little bit from license to license, functionality to functionality, but there are definitely cases where, no, you do not have to license every single user in your organization if you can make that clear distinction and if it follows all of Microsoft's terms of service.
Okay, let's go. Vic has a question here. Conditional access is an Azure AD premium license. Can I use this with any of the Microsoft 365 business plans?
Yes, you can add Azure Active Directory Premium to the business plans. Business Premium, the top, I think that's the top level now. The Business Premium plan, it's like the $20 or $23-ish a month one, actually includes conditional access as well. So if you're on that highest tier business plan, you actually have conditional access. Lower ones, I believe it's still the case. And I think I saw it recently that you can go in and add those. I know you could with the old business plans. I don't think anything changed when they kind of rebranded all those.
Okay, James is wondering, why is it so hard to find out what app is in violation?
What app is in violation? Do you have any more clarification there, James? Violation of what? Is this like from a logging perspective, from an authentication perspective?
James, follow up with another question and with a clarification. We'll go on to, so this is kind of a long one, but I'm going to give it a try. This is from Mario. Hi, we just enabled MFA in our environment. However, we have an issue with new users. So basically, we have new users, like 50 new users a month, but they don't all use a device. Use a device that they have the desktop. I'm sorry, I get it now. They don't use a device. They have a desktop. But because we have a conditional access not to prompt users on the network, we now have a gap in users registering for MFA. How can we prompt new users for MFA for the first time they log in to the environment? This is causing a lot of issues, and we're doing it manually, but we are looking for an automated process to get this done. Any help or ideas? I am so sorry, Ben. That was a really long one, but it's really an issue that Mario's hoping to get some advice on. Did that make sense to you?
It did. That's a really good question. I don't have the URL off the top of my head. There is a MFA registration site that you could send people to, and I'm trying to see if I can find it really quick. That Terranet Legacy. There's a URL you could go to, and yeah, I'm not going to be able to pull it up super quick, but you could send those new users as part of their onboarding to go to this URL and register for MFA when they first set it up. And yeah, I was just trying to quickly find what that URL is, and it's not coming up for me, and I don't remember it, because there's ones that you can send them to too for like self-service password reset. So forcing them to go through it is going to be hard, but making it part of onboarding, you set up your computer, you log in, go visit this particular URL. And I'm sorry, I wish I could find it and had it off the top of my head, but go visit this URL and set up MFA, or go through this particular process and set up MFA right after you log in. That's about the best I can think of that would help in that particular scenario.
Okay, we've got some clarifications from, I'm sorry, go ahead, please, sorry.
All right, no, I was going to say, I've had that experience when I've set up an account with different organizations too. So I know it's possible, I just can't remember what it is. Oh, there you go. I just saw
Okay,
someone posted it in the questions, John. Push that URL out there.
Okay, I'll find it. And in the meantime, James gave us some clarification on his question about why is it so hard to find out what app is in violation. Let me grab this here. He says, it's from Defender for Endpoint. When someone accesses a, quote, blocked app or resource, all we get is a loop in the security center that leads back to its own incident.
Oh, okay. Without seeing the loop, I don't know. One thing I would say, James, is have you gone in and used like that incident or that loop and tried to actually look at the logs themselves? Either using advanced hunting in, I think advanced hunting is in the security center, but use like advanced hunting, or that's one of those cases too where you may be able to pull them into Sentinel or log analytics. I have found that sometimes Microsoft creates some incredibly annoying loops like you're talking about where you can't get down to what you're trying to see. But if you go query the logs and use the particular information in that incident to go look at the raw logs, you might be able to find that information or see it and pull out like that application or more details around it. If I get stuck in a loop, that's what I would do, is go to the raw logs and run a query there.
Okay, so Victoria pushed out that URL, so you guys should have that. Okay, Ramonda's asking again, what is the best, I'm sure we'd answer, what's the best method to protect our environment from non-employee consultants who access our company resources? What's the best method to protect our environment from non-employees who access our company resources?
So one of those would just be security, kind of like the labels I talked about as well, where you could label certain sites or teams in a certain way, and those are inherently going to maybe block those external users or those guest users. I would also, that's going to be the biggest one, is a lot of security. DLP policies are another good one, so that maybe they can't download them or access some of that sensitive information. DLP policies can go in and outright block sharing content that has certain sensitive information in it, PII, that type of stuff. That would be another way you could protect some of it. Those are going to be two of the big two. Again, that's a scenario that I would try to dive into a little bit more and figure out exactly what type of content, where it is, and come up with different ways to protect it. But those are a couple thoughts. Conditional access, you can enforce guests to have MFA. There's some licensing that comes into play there, 5 guests for every one Azure Active Directory Premium license. But if you're more just worried about like their account being compromised, you can put MFA on guest accounts too. So that could be a protection method. A few of those different ones are where I would start.
Awesome. Got a question from Teresa where she's asking, are these available on the E3 plan? Maybe Teresa, clarify what you mean. What are these in your question? Maybe just restate it. Meanwhile, Carrie was asking about some suggestions for controlling sprawl of SharePoint and Teams. I know you talked a little bit about this, but she's wondering how can you set that up? Can you set up that gate?
Yep. So there's a really good third-party app that'll do it. Again, because of sponsors and third-party apps and all that, I am not going to mention it here. Find me on LinkedIn. Search for my name, Ben Stednick. I'm easy to find. I can share it outside of this. Is one way. Another way is I've done it with Power Apps, Power Automate, and some PowerShell running in like Azure Automation or some requests to Microsoft Graph, so that people essentially go in, fill out a request in a SharePoint list, and Power Automate is what goes in and creates the team or the site in the background using a service account. And then you can use Azure Active Directory premium. This is one of those premium licenses I was talking about for just a handful of users. And you can limit who can create groups, teams, and SharePoint sites with security groups and say only people in this security group have access to create teams and groups. SharePoint Admin Centers, there's a few different places you can turn off self-service site creation as well. That's where I would go with those.
Whoa, I totally lost track of time. We're getting focused on this. This was an awesome session, Ben. That's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much. I appreciate the links and the great content. Let's see here. So again, just thank you, Ben. I appreciate for a great session, and thanks to our sponsors, CoreView, Backupify, AvePoint, and Chaosoft for making this session possible. We're going to go to a short break, but we'll be back at the top of the hour, or I guess it's past the top of the hour. Sorry, guys. For our second session, Microsoft 365 Security Best Practices for Enterprises, led by scientist, author, and 20-time Microsoft MVP, Brian Posey, and moderated by my colleague, the media maestro from Montana, David Rammel, who leads the editorial team at Virtualization and Cloud Review. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsors. And remember, during today's third session, we will be giving away a set of high-end Bose wireless noise-canceling Bluetooth headphones. But you must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. And a big thanks to our sponsors, CoreView, Backupify, AvePoint, and Chaosoft for underwriting the summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Microsoft 365 Security Best Practices for Enterprises. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, 20-time Microsoft MVP, technology writer, and commercial astronaut candidate. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of his blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column. Brian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, David. And hello, greetings, and welcome to everyone out there in the audience. Super excited to be presenting this topic. You know, it's kind of funny, but the topic of Microsoft 365 security keeps coming up over and over, and I think that's because it's such an important topic. I mean, I seem to recall being invited to speak on this topic back in October, and that one kind of sticks out in my mind because I spoke on Office 365 security, and then less than an hour later, I was getting suited up for an underwater spacewalk, so kind of a hectic day. And then there was another one in, I think, February. So in spite of having already spoken on this topic a couple of times, I'm going to do my best to keep this material completely unique. There's a small amount of overlap, but the vast majority of what I'm going to be talking about is new material. And my main goal for this presentation is to give you some actionable things that you can take back today and do in your own organization. So there's going to be a little bit of hands-on stuff. There's going to be a little bit more conceptual stuff. Should be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, the very first thing that I need to talk about is something called Microsoft Secure Score. And if you heard me talk about Microsoft 365 security in the previous sessions that I mentioned, this is something that I mentioned in both of those sessions. And the reason why I keep bringing this up is because it's important. The reason why I say that is because it's absolutely impossible to adequately secure your Microsoft 365 environment if you don't know where you stand, both before and after whatever security measures you decide to implement. So Secure Score is great for that. It can help you assess your current level of security. It can give you recommendations as to what you need to do to enhance that security, and it gives you a way of coming back later on and making sure the changes that you've made have had the desired impact with regard to your overall security. So that's one of the big lessons, is that Secure Score is one of those things that needs to be revisited periodically. It's not enough to just go in, check your Secure Score, follow the recommendations, and never touch it again. Because remember, Microsoft security best practices change from time to time. And a lot of times those changes are reflected in Secure Score. So you may over time see your score to go down even if you haven't necessarily done anything, just because Microsoft's best practices have changed. So it's really important to go back and revisit that from time to time. So I've provided a URL on the slide that can get you to the Microsoft Secure Score for your Microsoft 365 deployment. But I just want to take a second right at the top of this presentation and kind of show you what this looks like, just for the benefit of anybody who might not be familiar with this particular tool. So this is what Secure Score looks like. And you can see in the big bold about halfway down the page on the left, we have Secure Score 18.64%, which is a ridiculously low score, by the way. So the idea is that Microsoft gives you a numerical score based or expressed as a percentage, showing what percentage of the improvement actions have been performed. So the higher the secure score, the more secure the Microsoft 365 deployment presumably is. Now, if you look in the center lower portion of the slide, you can see that we have a number of improvement actions. So we have things like require multi-factor authentication for administrative roles, ensure all users can complete multi-factor authentication and it's cut off, enable policy to block legacy authentication, and so on and so forth. So these improvement actions are things that Microsoft recommends that you do. And these aren't generic, whereas the same things are listed for everybody. Instead, these improvement actions are listed based on the way that your environment is configured right now. So if, for example, multi-factor authentication for administrative roles was already implemented, you wouldn't see this on the list. Now, there's two other things that I want to quickly point out about the improvement actions. One is the score impact. On the one for require multi-factor authentication for administrative roles, for example, you can see a score impact of plus 16.95%. What that means is that if you take this action, then the numerical secure score, the one that I pointed out that's expressed as a percentage, 18.64 in this case, will be increased by 16.95% as a result of you taking that action. Now take a look at the status column. Right now, all of these are listed as to address, and that's the default configuration for each of the improvement actions. But if you look just above the list of improvement actions, you can see that we have all of these categories. Regress, to address, planned, risk accepted, recently added, recently updated. And these come about from the status. So you can actually change the status of these various items, and that will be reflected in that dashboard view in the Actions to Review section. So if, for example, you decide to simply accept a risk, well, you'll see that risk accepted counter increase by 1 as a result of you making that change. So that's just a really quick overview of the Microsoft Secure Score. So let's get on to the best practices. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I decided to give you a top 10 list of best practices that Microsoft is currently recommending. And this one was tough because, as I said, I was trying to stay away from things, for the most part, that I had already addressed in previous presentations. But in researching this presentation, I found a document on the Microsoft website, Top 10 Ways to Secure Microsoft 365 for Business Plans. And I've provided a link to that document on this slide so that you can go and check that out for yourself, and I would highly encourage you to do that. So the reason why I chose this particular document is, one, it was unique as compared with things that I've already talked about in some of the other presentations. The other reason why I picked this particular document is that it was relatively new. So this, to the best of my knowledge, reflects Microsoft's latest best practices. So the vast majority of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about tie back directly into that document. Now, I am going to be throwing in some advice of my own. It's not good. This presentation isn't just purely a rehash of that document. I am going to be giving you some of my own guidance as we go along. So the very first one on the list, not surprisingly, is enable multi-factor authentication. And according to Microsoft, and this document comes from 2019, there are over 300 million fraudulent sign-in attempts to our cloud services every day. And then they go on to say that multi-factor authentication can block over 99.9% of account compromise attacks. Now, anytime that you see a statistic, I think it's worth digging into a little bit more. Obviously, we won't have time to dig into all of them, but there were a few things that kind of stood out to me about this. First of all, these statistics are from 2019, so this is pre-COVID era. And thinking back to that time, we have over 300 million fraudulent sign-in attempts to our cloud services every day. So around the time that this was written, 300 million was roughly about the population of the United States. The U.S. population may have been a little higher, a little lower, But think about that. The entire population of the United States, that's the number of fraudulent sign-in attempts that there were every single day. Now, another thing that kind of stood out to me about that is the words, to our cloud services. So in other words, these aren't the number of fraudulent sign-in attempts that happen globally to every single cloud provider on a daily basis. This is just to the Microsoft Cloud. And this was a few years ago. So you can only imagine what that number is today. Something else that I wanted to point out is that Microsoft goes on to say that multi-factor authentication can block over 99.9% of account compromise attacks. Now, having said that, this number has changed a little bit over time. I've seen a few different numbers recently, and when I was putting these slides together, I couldn't find the ones that I was looking for. I've seen this number go as low as, I believe it was 88%. The main number that I've seen several times recently was about 95%. So you can't completely trust the number because the number does tend to vary. But what you can glean from that is that whether it's 88% or 99% or 95%, it's a big number. So you can head off a huge amount of account compromise attacks just by enabling multi-factor authentication. That's the main thing that you need to know about this particular best practice. So Microsoft gave a few more statistics within this particular presentation. Let's take a look at a few of these. I've already talked about some of them, but we have 4,000 daily ransomware attacks and 167 million daily malware attacks. Those are huge numbers, and remember, this was back in 2019. These numbers have only increased since then. Additionally, we have 81% of breaches are caused by credential theft, and 73% of passwords are duplicates. So that's where a user sets up a password, uses it in your organization, and then uses that same password on their Amazon account or on their YouTube account or whatever else they happen to be using, just because it's tough to remember multiple passwords. So it's clearly in your organization's best interest to rein in those passwords, do what you can to secure them. Keep employees from using duplicate passwords if at all possible, which I know is a tall order. It's really tough to pull that off. But if you're able to convince employees not to use duplicate passwords, that's absolutely a good thing. And then the very last statistic on here, 50% of employees use apps that aren't approved by the enterprise. And again, this is pre-COVID. So this was before everybody started working from home from personal devices. Even back then, 50% of the employees were using applications that weren't authorized. You can only imagine what that number must be right now. So this simply underscores the importance of maintaining good security in your Microsoft 365 environment. So I mentioned the importance of enabling multi-factor authentication. And one of the things that I ran into as I was doing that was a Microsoft article, and again, I've provided a link to this, where they give you instructions for adjusting session lifetime limit settings. The basic idea is, I'm sure that we've all seen these prompts, like the one that's shown on the slide, where you go to access a Microsoft 365 application or something in Microsoft Azure, and you get a pop-up saying, do you want to stay signed in to reduce the number of login prompts, or whatever it says. If you say no, then every time you open a new browser window to access a Microsoft service, you're going to get prompted to log in yet again. If you say yes, then most of those prompts go away. Well, Microsoft actually lets you make some adjustments to this, and also to multi-factor authentication. So when a user is required to perform multi-factor authentication, that multi-factor authentication stays good for a certain number of days that you specify. So the user isn't constantly being prompted to enter a code off of their phone or perform some other type of multi-factor authentication. So it's really important to strike a balance, because you don't want to make things too lenient where the user signs in once and enters their multi-factor authentication code and they're never prompted for any of that ever again. But at the same time, you don't want to just constantly be pestering them with prompts. So there's a balance somewhere in the mix, and I wanted to provide this link just so that you could go out there and check this out for yourself. So best practice number 2, train your users. And I've already talked about this just a little bit, but basically what Microsoft is getting at with this particular best practice is that it's a good idea to establish a culture of security awareness. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but the idea is to talk to your users on a regular basis about the importance of security and about little things that they could be doing to operate in a more secure manner. Some of the other things that Microsoft recommends along this line are using strong passwords, protecting devices, and enabling the available security features, whether the users are working from a Windows 10 machine, a Windows 11 machine, a Mac, or what have you. Now, one of the ways that you can help to educate your users is through attack simulation training. And this is one of those areas that I've touched on from time to time in some previous presentations, but I wanted to quickly go over this just for anybody who might not have seen it. The idea is that right now, one of the single biggest threats to organizations of every size is phishing attacks. You know, the users receive an email, they click on a link, and next thing you know, your whole organization is infected with ransomware. So that's obviously something that you want to prevent at all costs. Well, what the attack simulation training is it's something that's built into Microsoft 365, and it allows you to launch benign phishing attacks at your users. You can direct these attacks at all of the users or at specific users, and the idea is to teach them how to recognize phishing messages and differentiate between a phishing message and a legitimate email message. So the user will receive this message, and then if they click on a link in the message, it will tell them that they've been phished, and you can even optionally make them take a short bit of training just to kind of educate them on what they did wrong. So let's take just a moment and take a look at what this looks like. So the first thing that Microsoft 365 does when you go into the phishing account or attack training is it asks you what type of phishing attack you want to perform. Now in this case, you'll notice that the credential harvest attack is selected and all of the other attacks are grayed out. And the reason for that is that the attack types that are available to you will vary depending on your Microsoft 365 subscription level. Now, in case anybody's wondering, I've got a Microsoft 365 E3 subscription. And so what you see, the credential harvest attack is the only one that's available with that subscription without purchasing add-ons. So you select the type of attack that you want to perform, and then the next thing that you're prompted to do is to choose the type of attack that you want to do. So we've already said we want to do a credential harvest, so we can send various types of payloads. So we have score $50 gift card for your IT feedback, we have bank device updates, we have a security upgrade. So when you select these various payloads, you can see a preview of what the message that is tied to that payload will look like. So in this case, we've selected security upgrade, and then we have Dear whoever, recent server update, kindly update to the latest security update to enhance your email functionality. Update now. Be aware that Office 365 will not be responsible for any loss of data. Should this warning be neglected, best regard, Microsoft Office. So we have this message that's going to be tied to that type of message that toward the specific payload that we've selected. So you can get a preview of what the message looks like. Once you've made your selection, then you're taken to a screen like this, so you can see the duration of the attack, you can see who the attack is assigned to. Now, if a user clicks on this, they're going to see a message like this. It's going to tell them, it's okay, you're human, let's learn from this. And then it says, rather than stealing your credentials like a cyber criminal, your IT team has redirected you to this educational page instead and assigned you some training material. So the user is being informed that, okay, they fell for a phishing attack, but it's okay, this was just a test, and we're going to teach you what to do next time. At that point, Microsoft 365 walks the user through several screens, similar to what you see right here, where they point out several different things within the phishing email message that should have been a red flag to the user. So on this screen, for example, we have URL hyperlinking, we have lack of sender details, and there are some other things that just wouldn't fit on the slide. So then, assuming that you've assigned training, the user receives another message prompting them to go and complete the training that you've assigned. So they just click on the link within the email message, and then they're taken to a training thing that looks kind of like this. And these training sessions are really short. They only last a couple of minutes, and they tend to be really simple. And they're multiple choice. So the user will see something telling them, hey, you received a message that says such and such, what should you do in this case? And then they're given multiple choices, kind of like what you see here, and then the feedback that the user gets depends on which option they select. So that's just a quick preview of the phishing attack simulations. So on to best practice number 3. Best practice number 3 is really similar to the best practices I'm getting ahead of myself. Best practice number 3 is to use dedicated admin accounts. So according to that article that I referenced at the very beginning of this presentation, the administrative accounts you use to administer your Microsoft 365 environment include elevated privileges. These are valuable targets for hackers and cyber attackers. Use admin accounts only for administration. Admins should have a separate user account for regular non-administrative use and only use their administrative account when necessary to complete tasks associated with their job function. So what all of this is saying is that if you're a Microsoft 365 administrator, it's a really bad idea to use one account for everything. Instead, you should set up 2 separate accounts for yourself, one with admin privileges required by your job, the other that's just a basic user account. You use your basic user account for all of the mundane things that you do every single day, such as checking email, browsing the web, or what have you, and only sign into that administrative account when it's necessary to do something that requires administrative privileges, such as onboarding a new user or making a change to a security setting or something like that. The reason for this particular best practice is relatively simple and straightforward. Let's suppose that you, as an administrator, were to receive a malware infection. It could be anything. It doesn't really matter. The malware that you receive is going to operate under the security context of the user who's logged in at the time that that malware was initiated. So if you have administrative privileges, then that malware that's running on your machine under your privileges also functions as an administrator and can do pretty much anything at that point. If, on the other hand, you're logged in as a regular user, then that malware is going to be restrained by the same restrictions that pertain to a basic user account. So some additional recommendations from Microsoft. Be sure admin accounts are also set up for multi-factor authentication, which should be a non-issue if we're setting up all accounts for multi-factor authentication. But if you choose not to do that for your users, just make sure that you're doing it for administrative accounts, because you always want to make sure that those accounts have that extra level of protection. Also, before using admin accounts, close out unrelated browser sessions and apps, including personal email accounts. So in other words, before you log into Microsoft 365 with an admin account, just go ahead and close out all of your browser windows, log out of anything that might be open. So that way, you're not having 2 different sets of credentials active at the same time. Also, after completing admin tasks, be sure to log out of the browser session. So you've gone in, you've done something that required administrative privileges. You're not going to want to just enter a different URL on the browser or into your browser and go off and do something else. It's important to go ahead and click log out and then close out that browser window and open up a fresh browser window for whatever it is that you need to do next that doesn't require administrative privileges. So best practice number 4, protect against malware, which I've already touched on a little bit. And incidentally, I found out yesterday that I'm going to be doing a presentation, I think it's next Wednesday, it's one day next week, on ransomware. So if you want to learn a lot more about ransomware and malware, be sure and check out that presentation. At any rate, Microsoft's 4th best practice is to protect against malware. So according to that Microsoft website that I had linked at the beginning, your Microsoft 365 environment includes protection against malware, and you can increase that protection by 1, blocking attachments with certain file types, and 2, using antivirus/anti-malware protection on your devices. Now, I think it's safe to say that we're all familiar with the concept of using anti-malware protection on devices, so I'm not even going to touch that one. We're just going to assume that that's being used. But I do want to talk about blocking attachments with certain file types. Now, there are a few different ways that you can accomplish this, and you're going to see another method a little bit later on in the presentation. But one of the main methods for doing that is to use mail flow rules. Now, mail flow rules are part of Exchange Online, and these used to be known as transport rules. So if you're not familiar with mail flow rules, maybe you've heard of transport rules. At any rate, mail flow rules are a mechanism in Exchange Online that allow you to take automated action based on certain things that happen. For example, different types of emails that are sent or received. And there are a huge number of things that you can do with mail flow rules, so I would highly recommend that if you're not already familiar with these, you go and check these out, because you can do a number of things to really benefit your organization's security just by tinkering around with some mail flow rules. So one of one of Microsoft's recommendations is to use Mailflow rules to block potentially malicious attachments. Now, initially, when you go out to the Mailflow rules in the Exchange Admin Center, the number of rules and the types of rules that you can create are somewhat limited, but there's a link called More Options. And if you click the More Options link, then the list of the types of rules that you can create will be expanded, and that's where you'll find the options for blocking various types of attachments. So what you would do in this case is go to the new rule screen, click More Options. You'll have to give your rule a name, so you can see that there's a name field up at the very top of the screen. Once you've given it a name, then go to Any Attachment, and then you can see that there's quite a few different options that you can take on an attachment. You can base the rule on an attachment that content that includes any of these words, or match patterns, or content that can't be inspected, or file names that match various text patterns, and so on and so forth. Now, there isn't an option on here that's explicitly targeted toward various file types, but if you do the option for file name matches these text patterns, then you can set up a rule that will look for attachments with file names that have various extensions. And then you can create a series of rules that look for message attachments that have extensions that are executable. And then you can filter those out. Also, a couple of other things that I should probably point out before I move on. Just beneath the Apply This Rule If dialog box, there's a checkbox that you can use to audit this rule with a severity level. So you can choose to add instances of the rule executing to your audit logs if you select this checkbox. And then just below that, there is an option for rule enforcement. Now, right now, this rule is set to be enforced. My recommendation would be, when you create a new rule, don't immediately enforce it, because sometimes rules can have unintended consequences. I couldn't even tell you how many times over the years I've created Mailflow rules, and they haven't done quite what I expected them to do. So it's a really good idea when you create a new rule to test the rule before you actually enforce it. So that way you can get a good feel for how the rule actually works. And then you can come back and turn on enforcement once you're confident that the rule does what it's designed to do. So best practice number 5 from Microsoft, protect against ransomware. So according to Microsoft, you can protect against ransomware by creating one or more Mailflow rules to block file extensions that are commonly used for ransomware, or to warn users who receive these attachments in an email. A good starting point is to create 2 rules. So here we are back to Mailflow rules. So there's 2 rules that Microsoft recommends creating with regard to ransomware. The first of these rules is a rule that will warn users before they open up an Office file attachment that includes macros. Because as we all know, Office documents can contain malicious macros. And, you know, I have to confess, this is one of those things that for the longest time when Microsoft first started making the recommendation about malicious macros, way back in the 90s, I didn't believe it initially. I thought, you know, okay, how much damage can an Office macro actually do? But I've seen a couple of examples of this in real life. And yes, for anybody who doubts, malicious macros truly are out there, and they can be very damaging. So anyway, the second rule is to block file types that could contain ransomware or other malicious code. So this is back to what we were doing a moment ago. And I mentioned earlier that I'll show you a couple of different methods of accomplishing this. So I will show you another method. So on the website that exists at the URL that's at the bottom of the screen, Microsoft actually provides you with the parameters to use for the rules as you create them in order to accomplish these 2 goals. So you can see that we have 3 columns here. The middle column is warn users before opening attachments for Office files. So the first thing that we have to do whenever we're creating a Mailflow rule is to give the rule a name. And really you can call these anything that you want, but I recommend giving the rule a descriptive name just so that as you accumulate more and more rules, it remains clear what a given rule does. So we have a name for the rule, and then we have apply this rule if. So we need a condition that will cause the rule to fire. So in the case of warning users before opening attachments of Office files, Microsoft recommends applying the rule if any attachment file extension matches, and then they provide a list of file extension types. So we have .m, docm, xlsm, and so on and so forth. So all of the file extensions that Microsoft uses. So then the next thing we have is do the following. What action do we want to take if this rule fires? And in this case, Microsoft is recommending that you prepend a disclaimer, and then they provide message text. So in other words, if a user receives a message containing an Office document with one of these extensions, and this rule has been set up according to the guidance that Microsoft is providing on the slide, then what's going to happen is that the user is going to open the message, and they're going to see text that was appended to the message, or rather prepended. The text will be displayed at the beginning of the message, and it will tell them, don't open these types of files unless you were expecting them, because the files may contain malicious code, and knowing a sender isn't a guarantee of safety. So let's take a look at the other one. The other one is block files that could contain ransomware or other malicious code. So again, we have to assign this rule a name, and then we need a condition that will cause the rule to fire. So we have any attachment and file extension matches, and then we have a list of file types. And this is a fairly long list, but I really like this because if you try to go out and create a rule like this on your own, it's really easy to miss a potentially executable file type. But here we have a really solid list provided by Microsoft of various file extensions that can be linked to executable code. So I would definitely recommend, even if you choose your own method for creating these types of rules, take a look at the extensions that are on this list. So then the action that's taken when this rule fires is block the message, reject the message, and include an explanation. So best practice number 6, stop auto-forwarding email. Now, I have to admit, this is one of those that I think absolutely makes sense, but it's not one of the things that I probably would have thought of on my own to include among a list of best practices. But it really should be there. The idea is that, let's suppose for a moment that a hacker manages to infiltrate your organization and they gain access to a user's mailbox. And let's suppose that that user is somebody who has access to sensitive information throughout the organization. Maybe it's somebody in HR or somebody in your finance department or something like that. Well, what that attacker can do is they can turn on auto forward. So every time that legitimate user sends an email message, a copy of that email message goes to a mailbox of the attacker's choosing. So the attacker is thereby exfiltrating or taking information out of the organization for their own purposes. And they can do anything that they want with it at that point. They might use it to gain insight into the way that the organization works so that they can launch a social engineering attack against it. They might choose to use the information for blackmail or to extort a ransom. There's any number of things that an attacker could do with the information gained by automatically forwarding the email associated with a sensitive mailbox. So how do you do this? How do you stop auto-forwarding of email? Well, once again, Microsoft recommends using mailflow rules for this, and they give us several different parameters that we can use to set this up. So let's take a look at what we've got. So the first thing that we have to do is to provide a name for the mailflow rule. And again, you want that name to be something descriptive. In this case, the name that they're using is prevent auto-forwarding of email to external domains. Then the next thing that we need is a condition that will cause the rule to trigger. So we have apply this rule if the sender is, and then you can use an internal or an external email address, and then inside the organization. You can also add conditions to a rule. So one condition that Microsoft recommends adding is the recipient is outside of the organization. And then we have a third condition, the message properties include message type auto forward. This is the important one because this is the one that detects if the mailbox is set up for auto forwarding. So then what do we do once we've detected all of these conditions? The next step in the process is to block the message. And then Microsoft says reject the message and include an explanation. And then they provide the message text, auto-forwarding email outside the organization is prevented for security reasons. So that way the user knows what's going on. If the user has enabled auto-forwarding themselves, then they see this message and see that, okay, the organization doesn't allow me to automatically forward my email. Maybe this is a bad idea. Or if the user has been infiltrated and they're getting this message, they're probably going to be thoroughly confused at that point, and maybe they would place a call to the help desk, who can then investigate the matter and find out why in the world this user's mailbox is being automatically forwarded. So best practice number 7, use message encryption. So according to Microsoft, Office message encryption is included with Microsoft 365. It's already set up with Office message encryption. Your organization can send and receive encrypted email messages between people inside and outside of your organization. Office 365 message encryption works with Outlook.com, Yahoo, Gmail, and other email services. Email message encryption helps to ensure that only intended recipients can view message content. So back when message encryption first came out, it was really limited in scope because typically it was easy to encrypt a message if you had one Outlook user in your organization sending a message to another Outlook user. But a lot of times it didn't work so well if you were sending to somebody who was on a different mail service. But now what Microsoft is saying is that message encryption is set up by default. There's not really a lot you can do, and you can easily encrypt messages even if the recipient's mailbox is on a different mail service such as Yahoo or Gmail or something like that. So when it comes to encrypting outbound email messages, there are two options: do not forward and encrypt. Both of those are important to be used in certain circumstances. So let's take a look at this. So what we have here is a screen capture of Outlook, and this came from the document that is linked just beneath. And you can see that there's a permissions button on the toolbar. And when the user clicks on permissions, they have all of these different options. It's set for unrestricted access by default, but we have encrypt and do not forward. So the encrypt option is exactly what it sounds like. If a user enables encryption, then the message is going to be encrypted so that only the recipient can read it. Anybody who's doing packet sniffing on the network and monitoring packets as they flow back and forth isn't going to be able to read the contents of the encrypted email message. Now, one of the points that I've often made is that there's a big difference between privacy and security. Encrypting email gives the user privacy, but it doesn't necessarily ensure security. There's a big difference between the two, because it's still possible to attack the user. You haven't really done anything to improve security. All you've done is given them a private channel for communication. So just a distinction to keep it in the back of your mind. The other option is do not forward. And this is an important one, especially for users who deal with sensitive data, because we've probably all seen or at least heard stories of somebody who sent an email message containing something sensitive, whether it's related to business or something personal, and then the recipient decided to forward it to the world. And then all of a sudden the person who sent the original message is exposed for whatever reason and suffers great embarrassment, and it never ends well. So by turning on this do not forward option, the sender can ensure that the recipient isn't going to be able to forward that message to someone else. Now, are there other ways of getting that message out there in spite of do not forward being turned on? Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing stopping the recipient from taking a screen capture of the message or taking a picture of the screen with their phone or something like that and then sending that out. But at that point, the person who's doing it has actively circumvented a restriction that's baked into the message. So they kind of have to take that extra step in overriding the security that's been put into place on that message. So best practice number 8, protect your email from phishing attacks. And this is a big one. This is one of those that I could easily do an entire session on. But let's take a look at what Microsoft has to say about the matter. In their best practices document, Microsoft says, if you've configured one or more custom domains for your Microsoft 365 environment, you can configure targeted anti-phishing protection. Anti-phishing protection, a part of Microsoft Defender for Office 365, can help protect your organization from malicious impersonation-based phishing attacks and other phishing attacks. If you haven't configured a custom domain, you do not need to do this. We recommend that you get started with this protection by creating a policy to protect your most important users and your custom domain. So, in other words, if you've got a custom domain name associated with your Microsoft 365 account, so for example, I use the brianposey.com domain name, then Microsoft provides protection that will help keep your domain name from being impersonated. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So what you see right here is a screen capture of Microsoft 365 Defender. Now what you want to do is go to Policies and Rules. You can see the blue arrow toward the lower left corner of the screen. So click on that tab. And then when you select Policies and Rules, you're taken to the screen that's shown right here. And you have a few different things that you can click on. So you're going to want to click on Threat Policies. At that point, you're going to be taken to the threat policy screen, and there are a number of templated policies and regular policies that you can choose from. So you'll want to choose anti-phishing. And then you're taken to the screen right here that allows you to create a new anti-phishing policy. And you can see on the screen that there's a default policy that already exists. But even though that default policy exists, it may or may not be configured to meet your organization's needs. So it's best to go ahead and just create a new policy. So what settings do you provide with that policy? Well, as with just about every other type of policy that you can create in a Microsoft environment, the first thing that you're going to have to do is to assign a name to that policy that you're creating. The name that Microsoft recommends using is Domain and Most Valuable Campaign Staff. You can obviously call this anything that you want. And there is a field that you can use to provide an optional description of that policy that you're creating. And the description that they use is ensure most important staff and our domain are not being impersonated, which is a pretty good description. So then the next thing that you have to do is add users to protect. So what you would do is select add a condition, and then the recipient is, and then type the names or email addresses of the person that you want to prevent from being impersonated. And you can add up to 20 different internal and external addresses per policy. So if you've got more than that, you're going to want to just create multiple policies. There's also an option to add a domain to protect. So you can click on add a condition, and then the recipient domain is, and then just provide your domain name. And you do have the option of entering multiple domain names if necessary. So then you get to the screen right here. So what do you want to happen if somebody on that list or domain on that list is being impersonated? Well, the only real option here is to enable spoof intelligence, and you can do that with a simple checkbox. Now, one thing that I do want to point out is that if I go back a slide or two, there's a URL at the bottom of this slide that provides the instructions that I'm using as I go through this portion of the presentation. And if you go out to that URL, then what you'll find is that, let me get back to where I was, the guidance, which you can see at the top of the screen, says by default, mailbox intelligence is selected when you create a new anti-phishing policy. Leave the setting on for best results. So in the instructions on that website, Microsoft refers to mailbox intelligence, whereas in the actual interface that I use to create the screen capture, this feature has been renamed to spoof intelligence, not mailbox intelligence. It's a subtle difference, but I wanted to go ahead and point out that difference just to illustrate that Microsoft makes changes within the Microsoft 365 environment all the time. And a lot of times the documentation doesn't quite keep up with the changes that are being made. So you can sometimes run into situations like this where there's a bit of a mix match between what the documentation is telling you and what's available in the interface. So not a big deal, just something to be aware of. So then the next screen that you're taken to is the action screen. And this is where you have to tell Microsoft 365 what you want to do if one of those people is being impersonated. And again, this is one of those areas where the documentation doesn't quite line up with the options that actually exist. So Microsoft is telling you redirect the message to another email address, and redirection isn't even an option right here. Your only real option is to quarantine the message, and you can apply a quarantine policy. So off to best practice number 9. Now, best practice number 9 is protect against malicious attachments, files, and URLs. Now, one thing that I want to point out about this is that everything that I've talked about so far is something that's baked into, everything I've talked about so far are things that you can do with even the most basic Microsoft 365 Business or Enterprise subscription. But Microsoft makes a distinction between Business Standard and Business Premium. And the last two best practices that I'm going to talk about can only be implemented with Microsoft 365 Business Premium or something comparable in the enterprise realm. So best practice number 9 is to protect against malicious attachments, files, and URLs in email and Office files. And then best practice number 10 is increase protection for your organization's devices. We won't get into that one too much. But let's go ahead and take a look at best practice number 9. Now, according to Microsoft, People regularly send, receive, and share attachments such as documents, presentations, spreadsheets, and more. It's not always easy to tell whether an attachment is safe or malicious just by looking at an email message. Microsoft Defender for Office 365 includes Safe Attachments protection, but this protection is not turned on by default. We recommend that you create a new rule to begin using this protection. This protection extends to files in SharePoint, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams. And then they go on to say that hackers sometimes hide malicious websites in links in email or other files. Safe Links, part of Microsoft Defender for Office 365, can help protect your organization by providing time-of-click verification of web addresses in email messages and Office documents. Protection is defined through a Safe Links policy. So what all of this is really saying is that you can set up a policy so that if a user clicks on a link within an email message or within a Microsoft Office document, then that link is going to be evaluated before the user is actually redirected to that link. So that way, if the link is something malicious, you've got that little bit of extra protection insulating the user against the action that they've just taken. So here we are back in the Microsoft 365 Defender, and I'm on the Threat Policies page, and you'll notice that the very last item at the bottom of the page is anti-malware. So you would go ahead and click on that, and then you're taken to the protection settings, you're taken to the create a new anti-malware policy screen. And the steps that you would create in the initial part of this are exactly like what we've been talking about over the last few best practices. You would provide a name and a description for the policy that you're creating. Then you choose the users and the domains that you want this policy to apply to. And then you come to the protection settings screen that you can see right here. So we've got a few different things going on. The first thing, you'll notice that there's a checkbox that is selected, and this checkbox allows you to enable common attachment filter. So in other words, you can filter out various types of files that you don't want a user to be able to access in the form of an attachment. For example, the very last file type that's listed right here is .reg. That's a registry file. So certainly you don't want some attacker emailing a user a registry file, have that user click on that and do something to their Windows registry. That would be awful. So this setting can help protect against that sort of thing. There's also a checkbox that you can select, and this one's disabled by default for whatever reason, but Microsoft does recommend enabling it to enable 0-hour purge for malware. And then you can also set a quarantine policy, and you can set up various recipient notifications, sender notifications, and admin notifications. And there are customizations that you can make here as well. You can customize the file type list, and if you want to enable safe links, that option is normally here as well. The subscription that I have doesn't have safe links built in, so that's why you don't see the safe links displayed on this slide. So for safe attachments, there's a few policy settings that Microsoft recommends. We start with the name and description. And then just beneath that, we have Save Attachments Unknown Malware Response. So you select Block, and then choose to block the current and future emails and attachments with detected malware. And then the next action is redirect the attachment on deletion, so you can enable redirection and then enter the admin account or the mailbox set up for message quarantine. So that way, once an infected message is detected, that message is forwarded to a quarantine mailbox where you can take further action on it if necessary. And then as far as who this applies to, this is where you would enter your recipient domain. For safe links, things work pretty similarly. You would start out by naming the policy. The next setting is select the action for unknown potentially malicious URLs in the message. So you would select on URLs will be written and checked against a list of known malicious links when the user clicks on the link. So in other words, a user clicks on the link, and then Microsoft 365 is going to go out and compare that link against links that are known to be malicious. And then you'll want to select the checkbox to apply real-time URL scanning for suspicious links and links that point to files. And then you would apply that to the recipient domain. And then, as I mentioned a little while ago, best practice number 10 is to increase protection for your organization's devices. And Microsoft's guidance, which you can see on the slide, is essentially to make sure that Microsoft Defender, as it's now known, Microsoft has changed the name several times over the years, is enabled and is operating, and that you have some sort of malware protection on your devices. in reality, there's a whole lot more that you can do to protect the organization's devices, and that's one of those things that I'm going to be touching quite a bit on in my presentation on ransomware next week. So with that said, we got a little bit of a late start, so I kind of rushed through the presentation, but I wanted to save just a few minutes at the end here for questions. So if we have any questions, we'll go ahead and take those now.
Okay, great job, Brian. We do have a lot of questions. Let's get to as many as we can. First come, first serve. An easy one for you, Brian, from John.
I like easy.
When you were talking about Secure Score early on, he asked, is Secure Score available at all levels? Mine do not populate.
It should be available at all levels. I mean, I could be wrong about that. It's certainly something Microsoft would be able to answer for you, but let's just say that I've never heard of an instance where it's not available. So if it's not populating, one thing that can cause that is if it's a relatively new Microsoft 365 subscription, it takes some time for Microsoft 365 to accumulate all of the data that it needs. So if the subscription is less than a month old, you may find that there's no data there and it doesn't populate. So just give it some time. But if it's older than that, then I would certainly talk to Microsoft about that one.
Okay. Next question comes from Randall. Can we restrict OneDrive access to Teams or SPO folders to only devices which have been joined to AAD and have been rendered secure?
Yeah, I believe that there is a way to do that. I think it's done through conditional access policies, but it's one of those things I would have to look up. I don't really know the answer off the top of my head other than to tell you that, yeah, you can do that.
Okay, time for one more question. It comes from Stephen. Why would I not use PIM and admin roles instead of using two separate accounts when you were talking about the elevated account and the regular account?
Well, I think what that really comes down to is that you have to do what's right for your own organization. What I was following was Microsoft's own best practices. Personally, I think it's just a little bit more comforting to have two separate accounts just because you do have strict isolation between those. And there's absolutely no way that if, say, privileged identity management or something like that broke down, that an attacker could figure out a way of using permissions to exploit you. I mean, if you're using a completely separate account, that's just not going to happen. But again, you've got to do what you feel comfortable with and what adheres to your own organization's policy. I certainly wouldn't discourage you from using PIM. I think it's a great feature. Just do what's right for your own organization.
Sounds like good advice. And it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Brian, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Thank you.